There's some bands where you can hear the first few seconds of a song and immediately know who it is. The Cars were one of those bands. Alternative band? Absolutely not. Influential to the alternative scene? Let's find out. The sound was almost impossible to mistake the dry, slightly detached vocals of Ric Ocasek, or Ocasek, however you want to say it, the warmer and more melodic voice of Benjamin Orr, Elliot Easton's razor-sharp guitar, keyboards and synthesizers from Greg Hawkes, and David Robinson's precise, almost mechanical drumming. Put all that together, and you get something that was somehow both futuristic and familiar. The Cars could sound like a new wave band. They kind of were. A power pop band. They kind of were. An art rock band. Sometimes they were. Or a straight ahead rock band. Sometimes within the same song. And that's probably the reason they have lasted so long and so well. They weren't simply an 80s band. They were one of the bands that helped create the sound of the 80s in the first place. Now, the Cars formed in Boston in 1976 with Ocasek and Orr already having a long musical history together. By the time Elliot Easton, Greg Hawkes, and David Robinson came into the picture, the pieces were finally in place. The band was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2018. What took them so long? And looking back at their catalog now, it's pretty easy to understand why they are there. The partnership between Rick and Ben, it was at the center of everything. They'd been playing together for years through groups like Milkwood and Captain Swing before the Cars finally clicked. Ocasek became the band's principal songwriter, mostly writing most of the material, but Orr was absolutely essential to the sound. Their voices gave the Cars something that a lot of bands didn't have. Ocasek's voice was quirky and cool and deliberately emotional almost, while Orr could sing with a genuine warmth and a vulnerability. That contrast became one of the band's signatures. Even when Ocasek wrote the song, Orr could completely change its emotional character simply by singing it. That's especially important when you get to songs like Drive, but it was there right from the beginning. And if you look at it, there's not many bands out there that have two lead singers. I can think of Squeeze just off the top of my head, but there's others, but that by itself was kind of interesting. And then came the debut. The Cars' self-titled debut album arrived in 1978. It's one of those records that sounds fully formed from the opening seconds. There really isn't much of a learning curve. Good Times Roll kicks things off with that instantly recognizable guitar and keyboard combination. Then My Best Friend's Girl and Just What I Needed make it clear this isn't some experimental band that accidentally stumbled onto a couple of catchy hooks. They literally were going to call this, at least they claim, Greatest Hits. They were going to call their first album Greatest Hits, and it kind of is a Greatest Hits album. They had the hooks, they had the attitude and the musicianship already figured out. Just What I Needed is probably the perfect example of what made the Cars work. The rhythm, it's tight, the guitar is clean but aggressive. The keyboards add another layer without taking over, and Benjamin Orr's vocals sound almost casually indifferent to the fact that he's written, or he's part of, one of the great power pop songs of the era, of any era. And then you get to You're All I've Got Tonight, Moving in Stereo, and All Mixed Up, and you know, those aren't hit singles, but they were on the radio a lot. I do remember that. Suddenly you realize there's a much stronger album underneath the hits. This wasn't just a collection of singles. It was a carefully constructed record. The debut went on to become one of the foundations of everything that followed. It's still arguably the album to start with if you want to understand the Cars or want to get into them. Arguably, I'm going to say not even arguably, the greatest, well, one of the greatest debut albums of all time. The Cars didn't have much time to enjoy the success of that album before they had to figure out what came next. And in 1979, they released Candy-O, and the easy thing would have been to simply make another version of the debut. They did sorta, but they moved on a little bit. Instead, they refined the formula. Let's Go was the obvious hit. I Like the Nightlife Baby, but Candy-O has a little more swagger than the first record. It's All I Can Do, one of my favorite Cars songs, has a softer, more melodic quality, while Dangerous Type and Double Life showed that the band was still interested in atmosphere and texture. Elliot Easton was particularly important here. He could play a guitar solo that sounded completely at home in a band with synthesizers and electronic textures. He wasn't trying to turn the Cars into a conventional guitar rock band, and that's what made his playing so effective. The album also benefited from the band's growing confidence. After you put out a first album like the one they debuted with, the second one, you're going to be more confident. The debut had sounded like a band arriving fully formed, while Candy-O sounded like that band beginning to understand just how much it could do with that formula. Then came Panorama, 1980. This is where the Cars get interesting and somewhat off-putting if you're not ready for it. If you only know the hits, Panorama can feel like someone deliberately turned the lights off. It's colder. It's much more experimental. There's less interest in immediately satisfying the listener and more interest in creating a particular mood. The title track is almost claustrophobic, while songs like Touch and Go show the band experimenting with, electronic edge with I want to say rockabilly. It's not really rockabilly, but kind of a country lilt. I don't know what to call it. This was not necessarily what everyone wanted to hear from the Cars after 2 successful records, and commercially it showed because it didn't perform at the level of the first 2. But I think Panorama is an important record simply because it demonstrates that the Cars weren't just chasing whatever had worked before. They were willing to make a weird record, and if you're going to do that, the third one is kind of the one you want to do it with. It's one of those albums that can change your perception of them. Suddenly, Cars aren't just the guys who made Just What I Needed. They're an art rock band that just happened to have a remarkable ability to write pop songs. In 1981, they kind of came back to earth, kind of came back to their main guns. They followed that detour with Shake It Up, and this time they kind of found a middle ground. The album had some of the experimentation of Panorama, way easy on it though. The hooks were back in a big way. The title track became a major hit, and Since You're Gone, one of my favorites of theirs, gave them another strong single. I'm Not the One showed another side of the band, while Victim of Love and Cruiser kept the rock element alive. Shake It Up is important, even though a lot of people kind of look at it as a lesser album. I like it a lot. It's one of the first ones I really got into because it sits right between the 2 versions of the Cars. The band that made it still had some of the strange angular qualities of the earlier records, but they were becoming increasingly comfortable with the idea that they could make sophisticated pop without abandoning their identity. And that was about to become very important because after that came Heartbeat City, and after that everything changed. 4 years had passed since Shake It Up came out, and when the Cars returned in 1984, the world had changed. MTV was exploding, music videos had become an enormous part of the way people discovered music, and synthesizers were becoming a dominant part of the mainstream pop and rock scene, which kind of gave the Cars an edge because they were kind of doing that already. Cars were perfectly positioned for it. Produced by Mutt Lange, who did Def Leppard's 2 biggest albums, it's packed with huge hooks, polished production, over-polished production, if you ask me. Heartbeat City turned the Cars from a successful rock band into a major pop phenomenon. You Might Think was everywhere. Magic was everywhere. Hello Again was everywhere. And then there was Drive. Drive is a song that really demonstrates why Benjamin Orr mattered so much, and his performance gave the song a humanity that Ocasek's voice might not have provided in quite the same way. There's something incredibly vulnerable about Orr's delivery. The song is restrained, but it isn't cold. It's almost the emotional opposite of Just What I Needed, if you think about it, and because the rest of the Heartbeat City was so polished and enormous, Drive just kind of became the emotional center of the album and became the Cars' biggest hit single by far. Years later, when people talked about what was missing from any Cars reunion, Benjamin Orr's absence, it was impossible to ignore. Even his bandmates acknowledged that his voice had been a crucial part of their identity. Heartbeat City also gave the Cars something that very few bands from that era managed to achieve. They became an MTV band without losing their musical credibility. You Might Think won Video of the Year at the first MTV Video Music Awards in 1984. And David Robinson's visual instincts had always been an important part of the Cars' presentation. The band understood that music was becoming increasingly visual, and they leaned into it without turning themselves into cartoon characters, although I would say the video for You Might Think was kind of cartoon characters. But after a record as successful as Heartbeat City, the next chapter was always going to be difficult. In 1987, the Cars released Door to Door, and it's probably the album in their catalog that gets the least attention, and that's not entirely unfair. In fact, that's completely fair. That's properly rated. It doesn't have the revolutionary impact of the debut, the strange atmosphere of Panorama, or the massive commercial identity of Heartbeat City, but it's worth revisiting. You Are the Girl became another hit. That one's a by-the-numbers Cars song. It could have been on any of their albums. And then there are moments where you can hear the band trying to reconcile their original sound with the increasingly polished production world around them. They actually dug up a couple of old songs that were, demoed for the first album. It just doesn't work here. There's also a sense that the chemistry was changing. Cars had been together for more than a decade, and the momentum that had carried them through the early records just wasn't quite there. Door to Door ended up being the final album of their original run, and the band broke up sadly in 1988. And once the Cars were gone, the individual members went in some cool directions. Ric Ocasek's solo career is probably the most extensive. He released a few solo albums, one of which he released, I think, one or two while he was in the Cars. Beatitude and This Side of Paradise. Then there was Fireball Zone. I think Troubleizing was another one. I've got all of them. But Ocasek's importance after the Cars wasn't limited to his own albums. In fact, far from it. He became a highly respected producer. He worked with bands like Bad Religion, Hole, Guided by Voices, and Weezer. He produced Weezer's famous 1994 debut album, the Blue Album, and later returning for the Green Album and Everything Will Be Alright in the End, probably my favorite Weezer album. He does some good work with Weezer. That production career is a huge part of Ocasek's legacy because it connects the Cars directly to the alternative rock generation that followed them. Lots of alternative folks were influenced by the Cars, trust me. Benjamin Orr also pursued a solo career, although his output was way smaller. His 1986 album, The Lace, gave him the opportunity to step out from behind the Cars' name, and it included the hit Stay the Night. Big hit, actually, but his story would ultimately take a tragic turn. He was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and died in 2000 at the age of 53. I didn't realize he was that young. It's hard to overstate how significant that loss was to the possibility of a Cars reunion. Orr wasn't just another former member. He wasn't just the bass player. He was the bass player, but he was half of the band's vocal personality, the singer of some of its biggest songs, and Ocasek's musical partner going back for years. Once he was gone, any future version of the Cars was inevitably going to be different. Elliot Easton took his own path as well. His solo album, Change No Change, came out in 1985. Great album, by the way. But his biggest contribution to the Cars' legacy may be the fact that he never stopped being an incredibly distinctive guitarist. His playing has always been one of the things that makes the Cars sound less like a conventional new wave band. He could play melodic, he could play pop-oriented guitar lines, then he could suddenly hit you with something that sounded like it belonged on a classic rock record. He understood that the guitar didn't need to dominate the song to make an impression. Greg Hawkes, keyboards, likewise remained pretty active, including solo work and collaborations. His importance to the Cars has arguably become more obvious with time. I mean, listen to their catalog without paying attention to the keyboards, you'd lose a huge part of what made them different. Hawkes wasn't simply putting synthesizer sounds behind guitar songs, he was helping build the architecture of the music. His keyboards could be bright and poppy, or they could be atmospheric, almost mechanical. And because he knew when to get out of the way, the electronics rarely felt like a gimmick. I mean, if you took him out of the band, it would sound weird. David Robinson's post-Cars career was quieter musically, but his contribution to the band's identity deserves to be remembered. Before the Cars, Robinson had already been part of the Modern Lovers, and he brought a strong visual sensibility to the Cars. Album covers, their videos, overall presentation. It was not accidental. They always looked like a band that understood the visual side of rock music as well as the musical side. Well, then came one of the strangest chapters in their story, the new Cars. In 2005, Elliot Easton and Greg Hawkes teamed up with Todd Rundgren and bassist Kasim Sultan and drummer Prairie Prince. The idea was not exactly to pretend that the Cars were still intact. Ric Ocasek was not interested. Benjamin Orr was already gone. David Robinson, not involved. Instead, the new Cars became a hybrid of Cars material, Todd Rundgren's material, and a couple of new songs. Well, Rundgren was an interesting choice because he was already a major figure in his own right, with a long history of adventurous pop and rock music. The group toured, including dates with Blondie, and released the live album It's Alive before the project ended, and it ended kind of sadly. I remember they were supposed to come to Charleston, and they canceled the show because of just lack of ticket sales. That's too bad. And then somewhat unexpectedly, the actual Cars came back. In 2010, the remaining four reunited in the studio. There was no attempt to replace Benjamin Orr. Instead, Greg Hawkes handled the bass duties, and the group worked with producer Jackknife Lee, big-time producer. What started almost casually became Move Like This, the band's first album of new material in 24 years. And here's the amazing thing. It actually sounds like a Cars record. Not like a group of older musicians trying to recreate Heartbeat City or anything, but like the Cars had simply picked up the thread after a very long pause. It sounded exactly like a Cars album, which was amazing. Move Like This is worth taking seriously. Sad Song, Blue Tip, Too Late. They don't sound like leftovers from 1987. The album has electronic textures, of course, dry guitars, odd little rhythmic details, and melodic hooks that made the original band distinctive. But there's a little more space in the production. There's something different there, but it sounds exactly like them. And emotionally, the record is impossible to separate from Orr's absence. I mean, Ocasek sang all the lead vocals, and the band deliberately chose not to bring in someone to imitate Orr. Fox even played an instrument that had belonged to Orr. The album album wasn't an attempt to pretend nothing had happened, it was the surviving members acknowledging the past while making something new. The reunion eventually led to another important moment. In 2018, the Cars were finally inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Ocasek, Easton, Hawkes, and Robinson performed together with Weezer's Scott Schreiner filling in on bass. How fitting is that? And Benjamin Orr was very much present in the conversation, even though he couldn't be there. The band had spent decades with the question of whether the Cars would ever be recognized on that stage, and when it finally happened, the absence of Orr made the occasion bittersweet. And it is a crime against humanity and music itself that it took until 2018 for them to get there. And then just a little more than a year later, Ric Ocasek was gone too. He died in September 2019, and it made that 2018 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame performance even more significant in retrospect. That turned out to be the final performance of the classic Cars lineup. Orr had already been gone for nearly 2 decades, and now the other defining half of that partnership was gone as well. It's tempting to look at the Cars now and divide their career into 2 simple periods: the great records of the 70s and 80s and everything that came afterwards. But I think the more interesting way to look at it is it was a band that was constantly balancing opposites, right? They were rock and electronic, pop hooks and strange arrangements, Elliot Easton's guitar and Hawk's synthesizers. The Cars were never completely one thing, and that was kind of neat about them. And that's why their music is held up. You can hear influences of the Cars all over alternative rock, all over rock, power pop, new wave, modern indie music, all that. They're everywhere. Their songs are incredibly catchy, but they're rarely simplistic. Their arrangements are polished, but there's usually something kind of strange hidden inside them. They could make a song as enormous as You Might Think, and then turn around and make something as melancholy as Drive. They could write Just What I Needed, one of the great rock singles of the late 70s, and then make Panorama, an album that seemed almost determined not to give the audience what it wanted. The Cars also had something that's increasingly rare, a genuine identity. You don't have to see the name of the record to know who you're hearing. Give me a couple of seconds to that guitar, the keyboards, the drum sound. I don't even need the voices. There's a pretty good chance I'm going to know exactly who it is. And maybe that's the best way to remember them. Not simply as an MTV band, because they weren't, but they were. Not simply as a new wave band, because they weren't, but they were. Not simply as the band behind Drive or Just What I Needed. The Cars were a band that understood where rock music had been, where it was going, and how those two things could exist in the same song. They started in Boston in the 70s, made one of the great debut albums in rock history, survived their own experimentation, conquered MTV, made one of the biggest albums of the 80s, broke up, got back together, ended up in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame after making a final album. It's a pretty remarkable story. It's pretty good work from the Cars. And maybe the most remarkable thing is when you put on the Cars today, it doesn't sound like a museum piece. It sounds immediate. Still sounds cool. Still sounds a little weird. And most importantly, still sounds like the Cars. And that's what great bands do. They don't just remind you of a particular time. They make that time sound like it still could be happening right now. Once again, thanks for listening. Make sure to like, subscribe, all that stuff. It does help the channel. There's something called hype points. I don't know what they do, but apparently they help channels, small channels like this one. We're trying to grow it, trying to, just make some good stuff for you. Till the next time, you guys be kind, rewind, and I'll talk to you later.